Speaking of areas of the world where people speak French, there's a province in the place we're talking about, Canada, by the way, and our two favorite Canadians actually arrive on the scene, Jim Park and Joanne Ritchie, of course. Well, we'll reverse that stream too. Joanne Ritchie and Jim Park. Canada Calling is one of the longest running segments on this show. And by the way, you're not going to believe it, guys, but from what I understand, Amelia Earhart has been found. Good morning to you, by the way. Good morning, guys.
Morning. How you doing?
I'm good. We got a Joanne in the house? Do I got a Joanne in the house?
You got a Joanne in the house.
There you are. Like I said, silence, like, pauses on television actually have real dramatic effect on the air. They tend to create terror in the man on the headsets.
On the radio, yeah.
On the radio.
I just wanted to say, by the way, we have a French province, Quebec, but New Brunswick also in Eastern Canada has two official languages, one of which is French, and quite a few people in Canada speak French, not just in Quebec.
Well, even if it was just in Quebec, Joanne, it would be a lot of people speaking French for a country that actually speaks, a lot of English too. I mean, that's a great thing to kind of remind people of. But yeah, let's get to Amelia Earhart, shall we? Let's really kind of dig into Amelia. They found her. They found Amelia Earhart. Explain what I mean.
Yeah, they found her. It's a piece of our joint history that's been recovered. So you might remember back in April, we told you about the second disappearance of Amelia Earhart, this time from Harbour Grace, Newfoundland. So Harbour Grace, by the way, is on the east coast of Newfoundland. It's one of the oldest towns in North America. It dates back to the 16th century, and it's got a very rich aviation history. And it's a small town that takes a lot of pride in its aviation history. And among other things, it was a starting point of Amelia Earhart's 1932 transatlantic flight that made her the first woman to make a nonstop solo transatlantic flight. So one of the main attractions at the local park there was a life-size bronze statue of Amelia Earhart. It was designed by a local artist. It was donated by a pilot from Harbour Grace in 2007 to mark the 75th. Yeah, it was the 75th anniversary of her flight from Harbour Grace. So the statue's worth a fortune. It was both because of its historical significance and also the material that it's made of. It's very unique alloy used in the sculpture. It's almost 95% copper. And it's life-size, so weighs about 700 pounds. So you can imagine what that might be worth to a scrap dealer. Anyway, the town and a couple of corporate sponsors offered a $25,000 reward, no questions asked. And good news is that a couple of weeks ago, the statue was recovered thanks to a tip from the general public. So it was located in a wooded area near Heart's Content, Newfoundland, which is about a 20-minute drive up the road. And as feared, it had been cut into several pieces, likely to make it easier to sell off as scrap metal. But all the pieces have been accounted for, and the cuts were clean, apparently, so there's a pretty good chance that it can be restored. They've been talking with the people who worked on it originally. They've had a look at it, and they think that they could restore it. So the Newfoundland government had pledged $50,000 to the town to help with the replacement. So that money is going towards repairs. But there's two plaques that were stolen from the site. One was actually stolen before the statue, and ironically, there was a security camera system put in place after that was stolen. So the whole the whole stealing of the statue, the brazen stealing of the statue, was actually caught on video. So they're still looking for the culprits. They're still stole it. They're still looking for the two stolen plaques that haven't been recovered, but the reward will be honored. The town's just coordinating now with the funding and figuring out who the reward is going to. So it sounds like there may have been more than one person involved in the tip. While the real Amelia Earhart has never been found, still remains lost, the statue of the iconic aviator has been recovered.
By the way, this half hour of Canada Calling is brought to you by the statue of Amelia Earhart, worth $25,000, and boy, we're able to fund a lot of things because of that. No, I mean, these are the kind of things that just kind of hurt your heart to some degree.
I know.
And now that it's
Yeah.
resolved, you're kind of, I don't know what it is, but stuff like this, you just kind of go, oh man, come on, man. It's like when they
Come
poison
on,
those
yeah.
trees in Alabama after that Alabama-Auburn football game. You're kind of like, come on, dude.
Crazy.
What are
Yeah.
you doing? What are you doing? You know,
A lot of people might not realize too that Amelia Earhart has some fairly close connections to Canada. So even though she's born and raised there, is a huge part of your culture and your history. She's got some history here too. She worked as a nurse's aide in Toronto in 1917 and 1918 at the Spadina Military Hospital. Her sister was in Toronto, and she came up there to help. And many of her patients were military pilots who shared their flying stories with her. And on days off, they took her to some of the pilots arranged for her to go around, see their air training facility north of the city, and she experienced at the Canadian National Exhibition, the stunt flying and that sort of thing, and she acknowledged herself that her experiences in Toronto were part of what spurred her lifelong interest in flying. And of course, taking off from Harbour Grace for that historic flight was also pretty special. So we've got a special place in our heart for Amelia Earhart as well.
By the way, our conversation with Jim and Joanne actually continues to focus on aviation, which has been the big talk. I've been noticing that on social media from a lot of my Canadian friends who actually work in transportation. There has been a strike. There seemed to have been a number of strikes recently around North America, all of it basically demanding better wages. Which one of you would like to unpack this particular story, because it actually has a direct impact on transportation beyond just the skies?
Yeah, I'll take this one.
All right.
Yeah, this was Air Canada's flight attendants. They've been in a legal strike position since March of this year. Negotiations, of course, came down to the wire, and they wound up going on strike for a couple of days, actually. But the reason for the strike this time wasn't wages so much. Their main demand, the flight attendants' main demand, was to be paid for all the work they do. In aviation, pilots and flight attendants both are paid by what they call block time. This is a sort of an industry standard practice. And for flight attendants, that means they get paid from the time they close the door after boarding, before takeoff, and open the door again when they get to their destination. That's their window. That's where they earn their money. They don't get paid for boarding the airplane, deplaning the passengers, doing all the security checks, the safety briefing, etc. The famous, your seat card, the safety card in your seat pocket. All that is basically unpaid because the doors are still open, and the Air Canada flight attendants just drew a line in the sand and said, enough's enough. You pay us, for all we do, or we're walking out the door. And one of the examples that came up in the research I did, I wrote a story on Truck News about this. It was a commentary mostly, but I was comparing flight attendants to truck drivers and all the work truck drivers do that goes unpaid typically, especially in the long haul sector. But as far as the flight attendants go, you can imagine the flight attendants who work short haul flights, say a Toronto to Montreal flight, that's about an hour in the air. So they work for an hour boarding the plane, unpaid. They work for an hour in the air serving drinks and walking up and down the aisle. And the pay stops when the door opens. So They stand at the door greeting you on the way out, saying, "Have a nice flight, have a nice day, sir, take care, sir, all the way, sir." All that goes unpaid, and then tidying up the airplane afterwards. So that would typically pay a flight attendant an hour's pay for about 2.5 hours work. Not so bad on the long haul flights where they're boarding for overseas, where they get 6 or 7 hours in the air and only an hour or two on the ground. So that works out a bit better. But the flight attendants on the short haul routes, they get taken right to the cleaners. Anyway, I wrote this story about the parallels between the two careers, and got folks kind of excited here. We've been arguing about this issue up in Canada now, unpaid work, for years, I mean decades, and the government just refuses to accept the fact that truck drivers are working sometimes as many as 10 or 20 hours a week on the clock, but unpaid. And of course, on the clock means the ELD's ticking, so that takes away from potential driving time. So it's kind of a double whammy for truck drivers. But this issue's come up a bunch of times, and we've tried to address it with government officials and the Department of Labor here in Canada. These are federally regulated employees, by the way. I should say that. It makes a little bit of a difference in understanding the various labor codes and the rules that are in place here. So any interprovincial truck driver, anybody who crosses the border, international or provincial, is considered federally regulated and come under the federal labor regulations. And because truck drivers, this is how they get away with it. Because truck drivers are generally paid piecework or by the mile, or sometimes on a percentage of the revenue, the standard approach to hourly pay doesn't apply to them. They just turn a blind eye to it and say, well, you're not paid by the hour, so, your mileage is your mileage. That's how industry pays. So far, we've been unable to sort of crack that wall to say, well, you're on duty, you're doing all this required work, trip inspections, waiting time, what have you, because the industry has decided not to put that time on the clock, paid by the hour, the government just ignores it. So, and I should say, too, that is changing in the Canadian trucking industry. There are more and more companies now that are paying for everything drivers do. I want to give the good carriers credit here, and are paying for everything drivers do. Some are paying by the hour even while they sleep. They have a pay scheme that basically starts when you leave the terminal and when you come back to the terminal at the end of the week. All that pay is by the hour. Now, it's a reduced rate, but everything you do is compensated. So things are changing, but I just thought it was an interesting parallel between the flight attendants and truck drivers. And to be honest, even though you can imagine an airline goes on strike, it's a huge disruption to the traveling section of the public. There was pretty strong support for the flight attendants in their argument with the airline in terms of getting paid for all the time they put in on the job. The public was still very supportive of that. So I was kind of hoping to get some public support behind the truckers' plight, too, but so far that hasn't happened.
Well, it's interesting, Jim, and this is a longer conversation. I was having this a couple of weeks ago about the UPS strike. And every single UPS strike the drivers have won, and I've always made the argument they win it because everybody knows their UPS driver. So when they see that the UPS drivers are on strike, they see the guy or the gal that does their deliveries, who they like. And by the way, we see these horror stories about, things that go on airplanes. Most people's experience with a flight attendant is pretty spectacular. I mean, they tend to be, a little bit jaded in their sense of humor, but they tend to be very welcoming. If you play ball, if you don't behave like a Karen or you don't behave like a Todd, you tend to get nicely treated. They're warm, they're friendly. They'll treat you with respect. Anybody, by the way, who doesn't feel that way probably was the problem on an airplane. And in the same way, the UPS drivers have everybody likes them. I would argue, and this is a longer conversation. You made a really great comment, by the way. I posted something about content on LinkedIn that I actually saw, and you made a really nice comment that I couldn't agree with more about the lack of, longer conversations about canned kind of stuff going on. This is a place to have a real conversation about how it is. You can't be a surly independent operator who thinks the world, should leave you alone, and then simultaneously get angry when it does, and then doesn't help you out when you have problems, in the work sector. Is that I feel like that people don't get behind truckers because, as Dave likes to say, they see the truck as opposed to me, who sees my good friend Marshall. When I see a truck, I see my friend Marshall. I see my friend Trucker Bosun. I see Pack Rat. I see a lot of our friends. But most people, when they see a truck, what they see is, that's a truck. That's a scary thing. That gives us all the creeps. And the worst thing is, too, is the fact that we were saying this earlier on with Dean. Everybody was out there kind of sharing that video of the disastrous, tragedy that happened in Florida recently, not realizing it isn't calling attention to a particular problem in trucking. It's just confirmation for a lot of people's unfair biases about trucking. And both of you can talk about this for a moment if you want to, but the idea that truckers need to remember they have to, as much as it pains them and they want to be left alone, they have to be remarkable ambassadors for the industry in the way that flight attendants and UPS drivers are. Is that fair? Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. I just wanted to say too that as Park mentioned, there was a huge amount of public sympathy for the airline, the flight attendants, even by people who were horribly inconvenienced. But I think a lot of people really didn't realize that those people that were working for hours that they weren't paid for. It's kind of shone a light on that, and in fact, the federal government is launching the consultations into the unpaid work of the flight airline sector in particular, and other federally regulated industries, of which many truck drivers are. So this defiance on the part of the flight attendants who publicly ripped up the offer that they were given to go, the back to work order. This may actually, if truck drivers are out there talking about it as well, it may be what we need to start some change.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to pivot to Jim here too, because I have to tell you, you made a really good point earlier on, just like Joanne alluded to some of the other stuff you said earlier, is the fact that I don't know how many Americans know that the clock is actually, this is the most insane thing. Once you put it this way, a lot of people go, oh my God, that you literally on a clock that tells you when you can stop earning. And at the same time, you're doing your job, but the clock that tells you you have to stop is also not helping you earn money because those wheels aren't turning. I mean, it's the craziest thing that you're on the job, but you're on the job doing something you're not getting paid for. I mean, there's a better way to phrase that, but you see what I'm getting at here? You actually hit the nail on the head, that you're actually doing all kinds of other stuff that is actually technically on the clock. The clock itself, which is your enemy in the case of a driver, is inevitably, inexorably moving towards its destination, and you're not getting paid because you're not behind the wheel.
Yeah, I mean, how do you reconcile that? And standard, and it's the same with the airlines. There's that expression; it's built into the rate. Your pay is X cents per mile generally, and 25 years ago, 30 years ago, the rate was such that you could almost go along with that because, truck drivers did do pretty well back before deregulation, and even in the early years of deregulation, truck drivers earned a lot more than they do today. So that was maybe a bit more tolerable that, drivers could say or accept it. Yeah, okay, I'm going to make so many cents per mile over the course of a week, blah, 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 add it up, here's my paycheck. That's not too bad, thanks very much. But today, with all the delays and the heavier traffic and, complete disrespect from most shippers, you can spend, half a day at a loading dock it just doesn't work anymore. There's not enough there to support building that wasted time into the rate. And even stuff that's required, the trip inspections, all the mandated stuff that's actually noted in the hours of service regulations as, quote, on duty, not driving time. You're required by law to do it. So, why aren't employers required by law to pay for it? Right. That's my question.
And then the other thing comes up is that people say, well, if you want a better rate, just negotiate it. And you're like, yeah, but dude, when there are people out there who are more than willing to undercut you, people who are desperate, this is a very complex problem. Maybe we'll actually get to spend an entire segment talking about this in regards to how it affects both the Canadian and the American market. But we have actually got to pivot here because we got one more story that is well worth digging into. You just wrote an actually you didn't just, but you wrote an explainer piece on how truck rollovers happen and preventative measures as well. So let's kind of dig into that in the time that we have left.
Yeah, I did this story on how to prevent a rollover. The idea behind preventing a rollover is really to understand why they happen. And it's got all to do with, physics. You can get pretty complicated in working out the math on these things, but typically it's going too fast through a curve. So you say, well, what's too fast?
Yes.
There's a company called Rollovers. Their app is now turning up on several tablet ELDs around the industry. They've aligned with a few partners to put in the truck to help prevent this kind of thing from happening. But those two guys have done a lot of engineering and math on figuring out what is a safe speed to be going through a given curve. Now, there's no way anybody could sort of sit there and do the math themselves and say, okay, I'm going to go through this curve at 40 miles an hour and maybe I should go through at 30 or whatever the case may be. But it all boils down to the center of gravity of the truck and the speed that you're going. As you go through a curve, of course, you have these centrifugal forces acting on the truck. It all starts to get really complicated, but the taller the center of gravity on the truck, the more prone it is to tip over. It's like a lever. You have a longer lever, you have more force you can apply to the end of it. So when a truck goes through a curve, it tends to lean toward the outside of the curve, as we all know. And if you have a low center of gravity, like a flatbed hauling rebar or something, that's pretty close to the deck, you tend to be able to go through a curve a lot faster than you could if you were hauling livestock, for example, where you have, a ton or many tons of animals up high in the trailer, and the center of gravity is super high. So those kinds of trucks are really prone to rolling over. So what this app does, and I'm not plugging the guy really, but they've done the calculations in advance, and all you have to do with this app is put in your estimated center of gravity, which you can do by just knowing how tall your load is and where all the weight is concentrated. But the bottom line is the recommendation that they make through the app and both orally as well, just explaining to drivers, is if you see the yellow sign going into a curve that gives you a recommended speed, that's generally accepted as being for cars, not for trucks. And the recommendation that they make is basically take that speed and cut it by 2/3 to a half if you want to have better than even chances of coming through a curve without tipping the truck over. And this has, real-world consequences. If you're going through a roundabout or a long freeway curve with a very tall center of gravity on your trailer, you could be driving right into a rollover situation and not even know it, and actually be pretty much sideways before you're even aware of it in the cab of the truck. The story goes into a lot more detail. It's probably worth reading. It's on trucknews.com, and you'll find it there. But most drivers will say they had no idea this was about to happen to them because there's no clue inside the cab, because the cab of the truck behaves a lot differently than the back of the trailer does. And that's where the drivers tend to get into the most trouble.
The other thing is too is the fact that it's one of those things where you have to be proactive. I hate to be so obvious. It's one of those things that you can't get out of once you get into. I mean that's the thing is that once that process starts, there's only luck on your side at that point, right? So I mean this is one of those
Pretty
things
much, yep.
where I mean we make this really clear, guys. This isn't a piece of advice that once one starts, how to actually be able to tip the truck in the other direction and prevent it from going that way. That ain't happening unless you get really lucky. We're talking about this is one of those things where preventative action is what is necessary and to almost kind of it's really an example of mindfulness behind the wheel that you have to be completely aware of this because I think the reason it happens, Jim, is that people misjudge what they're looking at. I mean, yes, there are exceptions to people being maniacs, but I think a lot of the time is people see it coming and don't realize how sharp the particular turn is, do they?
They don't, and they don't realize the impact that speed and the center of gravity have on it. I mean, this is kind of a driver training issue, and it's also a seat of the pants issue because every curve, every trailer, every situation is going to be different. It's dynamic. You can't apply a 25-mile-an-hour rule to every roundabout, for example. They're all different. So drivers, I think, especially the newer, inexperienced drivers who haven't, got their head around how the truck feels at different speeds and how center of gravity affects it, will drive blithely down the road, not even realizing they are, within a mile per hour or two of a rollover. And because they didn't roll over last time, they'll go through that same curve again at the same speed next time, but maybe they'll have a different load on the trailer. It'll be a little bit taller, and over they'll go. And they'll be puzzled by that.
Jim Park, Joanne Ritchie have joined us for Canada Calling. Man, I got to tell you, the new format moves so incredibly fast. I look up, and it feels like just like the Carol Burnett show. Just before you know it comes the time we have to say so long. Thank you both so very much. Guys, go to obac.ca. We look forward to having them on the show again. We're still trying to work out with this incredibly packed schedule how we get you guys in more rather than less. Thank you both. Love you both. Thank you.
Great.
Take care.
See you.